On a cold, rainy evening, the city streets were slick with the sheen of wet pavement. Amara Williams, a black billionaire entrepreneur and prominent social justice advocate, drove her sleek black SUV through the quiet streets. She had just left an important business meeting, her mind racing with thoughts of the next steps for her company's growth, but more so, the recent challenges she faced advocating for racial justice in her field. Her latest initiative, an advocacy project aimed at dismantling systemic racism in the corporate world, had been met with resistance. Still, she was determined, relentlessly pushing forward, convinced that change was not only necessary but inevitable. As her car cruised along, the soft hum of the engine broke the silence. That's when she noticed the flashing blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. A police car was tailing her. She sighed. Another night where her success would be judged by the color of her skin. She wasn't speeding, and her registration and insurance were up to date. She had been pulled over before, but this time something felt different, more intense, as though the officer had already decided her guilt before even speaking to her. The officer's movements were stiff and deliberate as he stepped out of the car and approached her window. "Evening, ma'am. License and registration," the officer barked, his tone harsh. Amara handed over the documents, noticing the officer's cold, unwavering stare. There was no greeting, no small talk. Just the tension in his posture as he examined the papers. His eyes flicked between her and the paperwork as though he didn't trust her mere presence. "Everything in order, ma'am. Step out of the vehicle," the officer ordered abruptly. Confusion washed over her. "Is there a reason why? I'm not sure what the issue is." "I haven't broken any laws," she replied, trying to remain calm. "I said, step out of the vehicle." The officer's voice rose, suddenly hostile. Amara's heart began to race. She had dealt with discriminatory cops before, but something about the officer's tone tonight felt personal. She didn't argue. Carefully, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out into the rain-soaked street. Before she could gather her bearings, the officer lunged forward, shoving her roughly against the side of the SUV. The cold metal of the car pressed against her back as she stumbled, unprepared for the aggressive force. Her hands shot out instinctively to catch herself. "Hey! What the hell are you doing?" Amara's voice cracked as she struggled to regain her footing. The officer sneered. "You think you can drive through here without following the rules? I'll teach you some respect, missy." His hands gripped her arm tightly, twisting it behind her back as he shoved her to the ground. The sting of the wet pavement against her skin was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the sting of the officer's harsh words and callous actions. Amara could feel the burn in her chest as her anger began to boil over. "I didn't do anything! Stop!" she screamed, but the officer wasn't listening. His boot connected with her side, knocking the wind from her lungs. She gasped for air, feeling humiliated and helpless as he towered over her. The officer was just about to press his knee into her back when a faint, quick click sounded. It was so soft, so subtle, that even the cop didn't hear it. But Amara did. Her gaze darted to the far corner of the street, where a small cafe's glowing neon sign flickered through the downpour. Through the glass window, a young woman sat hunched over a laptop, her eyes fixed on the screen. But she wasn't just typing. She was watching. Zoe. Zoe was a tech genius, a prodigy who had caught wind of something much larger than a simple traffic stop. She had seen enough injustice, enough exploitation of people who looked like Amara, to know that the world wasn't fair. She had worked in the shadows for years, using her skills to monitor and expose digital corruption. But tonight she was a witness, an unwilling participant in something far darker than she had anticipated. The moment the officer's boot struck Amara, Zoe's hand shot to her bag, where a small hidden camera rested. The device was sophisticated, designed to capture everything in crystal-clear detail. In an instant, it was recording. Every word, every movement of the officer was now being documented, evidence for a truth that was ready to be revealed. Zoe's fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the camera's angle, ensuring it captured the full scope of the officer's brutal treatment. She had never intended to be involved in something like this. But the injustice was too blatant to ignore, and she knew she had the power to make a difference. Her heart raced as she continued to record, knowing that this footage could be the key to exposing a much larger conspiracy, one that reached far beyond this single incident. Amara struggled beneath the officer's weight, her pride bruised more than her body. But in her moment of distress, her mind flashed to the countless people she had spoken up for, the communities she had stood by in the fight against systemic inequality. She had always known that change was a long road, that the battles were often uphill. But this was different. The brutality was personal. She wasn't just a black woman being treated unfairly. She was a symbol of everything those in power feared, someone with the resources to stand up, to demand accountability, to fight back. She could feel her pulse quicken, her resolve hardening. She would not be silenced. But little did Amara know, the true scale of the danger she was in was just beginning to unfold. The officer wasn't just a racist cop with a badge, he was a small cog in a much larger machine of corruption, one that Zoe had started to unravel. And the woman who had been attacked was now at the center of a storm that threatened to expose a web of criminal activity so vast, so entrenched, that no one would be prepared for the truth. Amara's voice, weak but fierce, broke through the officer's cold indifference. "You think this is over? You have no idea who I am." But even as she said it, she realized the truth. He didn't care. None of them cared. He was just a tool, a small part of a much larger system designed to suppress, oppress, and control. Zoe's camera captured every moment. The officer's cruel actions, the fear in Amara's eyes, the rain-soaked street that had now become a battleground for justice. It wasn't just a brutal assault. It was a symbol of everything wrong with the system. In that moment, something changed for both women. Zoe's eyes locked on the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, ready to take the next step in exposing the truth. Amara, bruised and humiliated but defiant, understood that this fight was no longer just about her. It was about every person who had been silenced, every injustice that had gone unnoticed. She wouldn't let it end like this, not tonight, not ever. The battle had just begun, and Zoe's hidden camera would prove to be the key to everything. What followed would unravel not just the life of one cop but a system that had been built to maintain power at the expense of those who least deserved to be oppressed. Zoe sat hunched over her laptop, her fingers moving rapidly over the keys, eyes scanning the data streaming in. Her world was one of zeros and ones, a digital maze of algorithms and encryption that made her a secret asset to a government agency she never quite fully trusted. She wasn't in it for the money, the power, or the prestige. No, Zoe was driven by something else, something far more personal. She'd grown up in a rough neighborhood, seeing firsthand the brutal effects of inequality, discrimination, and systemic abuse. It wasn't just a job for her, it was a mission. That night, she was deep into a surveillance operation, monitoring local law enforcement's activities through her encrypted channels. She had access to private security cameras, citywide surveillance footage, and social media data. It was a quiet night at first, the usual hum of mundane activity. But everything changed when she noticed something in the corner of her screen, a shift in the camera feed, a slight movement in the distance. Her eyes narrowed as she zoomed in on the footage. The image of a police car flashing its lights in the middle of a dimly lit street caught her attention. As she enhanced the image, she saw a woman, tall, poised, and unmistakably out of place for someone to be treated with disdain. Zoe's instincts kicked in. She recognized the woman immediately. Amara Williams. Zoe's fingers froze for a moment. Amara Williams was no ordinary woman. She was the founder of one of the largest black-owned tech companies in the world, a billionaire, and a vocal advocate for racial justice. She had made waves in the business world with her relentless push for equality and fair representation in industries where black people were vastly underrepresented. Zoe had always admired Amara from a distance, her poise, her courage, her unwavering commitment to change. But she never imagined she'd see Amara in a situation like this. The officer approached her vehicle with purpose, his behavior uncomfortably aggressive. Zoe's gut clenched. She could tell something was off. When the cop yanked open Amara's door, Zoe knew instinctively that things were about to escalate. She adjusted her camera feed, carefully maneuvering it to get the clearest shot possible. The cold rain was pouring down, the street eerily quiet except for the confrontation that was unfolding. She leaned in closer, her heart pounding in her chest. The officer's demeanor was unmistakable, hostile, racist, and intent on putting Amara in her place. Zoe had seen it before, this arrogance from authority figures who felt they could act with impunity. She had witnessed enough police misconduct and unchecked brutality to know that this could easily turn violent. Her fingers gripped the edge of her desk, her mind racing. She had to act quickly, she couldn't afford to let this go unnoticed. Then it happened. The officer shoved Amara to the ground, and Zoe's stomach churned. She had the footage, the proof that no one could deny. But she also knew that this was bigger than one random act of police brutality. The officer wasn't just an angry, prejudiced cop. Zoe could feel it in her bones. There was something more to this. His actions weren't random. They were part of a pattern, a much larger network of corruption that was woven deep into the very fabric of the law enforcement system. Zoe's mind flicked back to a recent investigation she had uncovered about a group of rogue officers involved in illegal activities, human trafficking, bribery, and a slew of criminal operations. They had been using their positions of power to operate in the shadows, a criminal syndicate masquerading as law enforcement. She had been tracking them for weeks, but they were elusive, their connections too well hidden. And now, with this footage, Zoe had a key piece of the puzzle. This officer, this racist cop, was part of the very syndicate she had been hunting. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about one cop. This was about an entire system that needed to be brought down. Zoe knew that sharing this footage with her agency could expose the truth, but it would also put her in the crosshairs of those very criminals. She had been working in the shadows, never wanting to draw attention to herself. But now, she couldn't turn away. If Amara could endure the brutality of the system, Zoe could at least expose it. The stakes were higher than ever. She stared at the screen, watching the footage replay over and over again. It was a devastating snapshot of reality, a moment of brutality that was all too familiar to so many people. But it was also a catalyst for something bigger. This was the opportunity to expose the truth, to spark a movement that could finally bring accountability to those who thought they were untouchable. She clicked a few keys, sending the footage to her encrypted channel. She wasn't going to sit on this information. She would take it public. She couldn't let this woman, this champion for justice, be silenced, not when she had the means to fight back. She sent the footage to a trusted journalist she knew could handle the magnitude of the situation. It wasn't just about Amara anymore. It was about the entire system of corruption that had enabled this officer's behavior to thrive unchecked. Zoe's heart raced as she hit send. She leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the tipping point. But even as the weight of what she had just done began to settle in, she knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be dangerous. There would be consequences. But Zoe had seen too much. She had learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts told her that if she didn't act now, if she didn't expose the rot that had festered in the system for so long, no one else would. The next step was critical. She had to make sure the footage was seen. She had to make sure that Amara's voice was heard. The system would fight back, of course. But Zoe had something that they didn't. She had the truth on her side. As she watched the footage one last time, Zoe felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight. Amara's name had already become a beacon for change. Together, they could bring down the system of corruption that had perpetuated this kind of violence. And maybe, just maybe, they could spark the kind of change the world so desperately needed. Zoe sat back in her chair, steeling herself for what was to come. This wasn't just about exposing a corrupt cop anymore. This was about changing everything. Zoe spent the next several days in a whirlwind of action, her mind constantly racing as she processed the gravity of the situation. She had done the right thing, she knew that, But now came the hard part, navigating the labyrinth of corruption she had inadvertently stepped into. The footage had been sent out, but she was under no illusions about how difficult it would be to expose the truth. She had seen firsthand how powerful, well-connected figures could bury inconvenient truths, manipulating public perception and silencing dissent. It wasn't long before the first signs of retaliation began to surface. Her encrypted channels were compromised. Someone was trying to trace her. Zoe had always been careful, always worked in the shadows, but this was different. The people involved in the syndicate were dangerous, ruthless, and capable of much more than she had initially realized. As she delved deeper into the cop's background, she uncovered disturbing connections, far more sinister than she had imagined. Lawson, the officer who had assaulted Amara, wasn't just a racist rogue cop with a vendetta. He was embedded within a complex web of criminal activity. Zoe's fingers flew over the keyboard as she accessed files, cross-referencing data from various agencies and resources. Each revelation was more unsettling than the last. Lawson had ties to a secretive, underground syndicate, one with connections to organized crime, illegal arms deals, and even human trafficking. The network stretched beyond the local precinct and extended into the higher echelons of law enforcement, politics, and corporate industries. It was a system built on a foundation of fear and greed, where law enforcement officers like Lawson acted as enforcers for the syndicate, covering up crimes and manipulating investigations. Zoe had stumbled onto something much larger than she had anticipated. The cop's behavior wasn't an isolated incident, it was a symptom of a much deeper rot. The officer had been using his position to provide protection for the syndicate, covering up illegal operations and obstructing justice. This wasn't just about a single abuse of power, it was about a network of corruption that needed to be dismantled before it could metastasize further. But as Zoe dug deeper, she realized that exposing this kind of network wouldn't be simple. This wasn't just about a corrupt cop. Lawson's involvement in these criminal operations made him a valuable asset to a much larger and more dangerous organization. The people behind it weren't going to let their operations be exposed without a fight. Zoe knew that. She'd seen it before, how those in power would stop at nothing to protect their interests, no matter the cost. Her mind raced as she pieced together the information she had gathered. Lawson had been protecting a series of illegal deals, from weapons shipments to money laundering operations. He had been part of the enforcement wing of the syndicate, ensuring that any investigations into their operations were either buried or manipulated. His badge had been a tool for perpetuating injustice, and the entire system had turned a blind eye to his actions. But now, the walls were closing in. Zoe wasn't naive. She knew what was at stake. If she continued down this path, she would be exposed, likely targeted by the syndicate for elimination. But there was no turning back. She couldn't sit idly by while this network continued to exploit the very system meant to protect people. She had the evidence now. She had the key to unraveling everything. Her phone buzzed. A text from the journalist she had sent the footage to. The message was short but direct. It's getting attention. The story is about to break wide open. But they're already trying to bury it. Be careful. The weight of those words hit her hard. She had known the risks, but seeing it written out in black and white made it all too real. This wasn't just a story anymore, it was a war. A war against an entrenched system of power that would stop at nothing to protect itself. Zoe's pulse quickened as she sat back in her chair, contemplating her next move. She needed to act quickly, but with caution. She couldn't take this on alone. She needed help. She needed Amara. Zoe had watched the footage of Amara's assault again and again. There was a fire in her eyes that Zoe admired, a relentless determination to rise above the injustice. Amara's status as a billionaire and an influential public figure gave her a platform. She could fight back in ways that Zoe couldn't. It was time to reach out, to pull Amara into the fold. This wasn't just about protecting her anymore. It was about bringing down the entire corrupt system. Zoe quickly drafted a message to Amara. She knew it wasn't going to be easy. Amara had been through enough. But this was the only way forward. The story had to be told, and the truth had to come out, no matter what it cost. Amara. I've been following the situation. I know what happened to you. The cop who attacked you, he's not just any officer. He's part of something much bigger. A criminal syndicate with deep ties to law enforcement, politics, and organized crime. I have evidence. I need to show you everything. Zoe. She hesitated before hitting send, but her instincts told her this was the right move. The silence in the room felt suffocating as she waited for a response. Minutes passed. Then, a reply came through. Amara's response was brief, but it was all Zoe needed to see. Tell me everything. It was a turning point. Zoe felt the weight of the moment, the enormity of the fight ahead. Amara wasn't just a victim in this story, she was a catalyst for change. The world knew her as a successful businesswoman, but Zoe now saw her as a force for justice, someone who could help expose the network of corruption that had festered for too long. Zoe quickly compiled the data she had collected on Lawson, the syndicate's operations, and the deeper implications of the corruption. She couldn't afford to hold back now. She had to give Amara everything she knew, every detail that could bring the syndicate to its knees. Zoe had worked in the shadows for too long, but now the light was on them. The truth would come out, and they had to be ready to face the consequences. As she hit send on the encrypted file, she knew there was no turning back. They were about to go head-to-head with a dangerous, far-reaching network, and the odds were stacked against them. But Zoe felt something inside her shift, a sense of purpose, a realization that this was bigger than her, bigger than even Amara. This was about creating a future where justice wasn't something that people had to fight for, but something they could trust. A future where the corrupt could no longer hide in the shadows. She sat back in her chair and took a deep breath. The pieces were in place. Now, it was time to fight. Amara sat in her study, staring at the screen in front of her. The message Zoe had sent was still open, the weight of it pressing down on her. The realization of what she was about to dive into settled heavily in her chest. She had always fought for justice, for a world where people didn't have to endure the systemic racism and inequality that had defined so much of her life. But now, she was facing something far more sinister, something darker than she could have imagined. She had been a target of hatred before, but this was different. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was part of a much larger conspiracy, one that had roots in the very system that was supposed to protect people like her. She couldn't let herself be consumed by the fear of it. If she was going to make a difference, this was the moment. This was the fight that needed to be fought. She wasn't going to allow herself to be a pawn in this game of corruption. She had built her career, her wealth, not just on business savvy but on resilience, the kind of resilience that had been forged in the fire of discrimination, prejudice, and inequality. Now, she was going to use every ounce of that resilience to expose the truth. She read through Zoe's message again. The evidence. The proof. It was all in her hands now. Lawson, the officer who had assaulted her, was part of something far more dangerous. A syndicate, a network of criminals embedded within law enforcement and other powerful sectors. Zoe had uncovered it, and now it was time for Amara to take action. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She had always been a public figure, but this was different. She wasn't just advocating for change anymore, she was about to blow the lid off a dangerous network. She had no illusions about the dangers this posed. The people behind this syndicate weren't going to let her, or Zoe, expose them without retaliation. But that was exactly why she had to do it. The risk didn't scare her, it fueled her. Amara didn't know where this would lead, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to back down. She had spent her whole life fighting for equality, for the kind of world where everyone could rise, no matter their race, gender, or background. If she was going to make that world a reality, she couldn't be afraid to face the monsters hiding in the shadows. They had underestimated her before. They wouldn't make the same mistake again. She quickly drafted a response to Zoe, feeling a rush of determination. Zoe, I'm in. We do this together. I'll help expose everything. Let's bring them down, asterisk. She sent the message before she could second-guess herself. Now, there was no turning back. The first step was to make sure that Zoe's evidence was ironclad. Amara knew that the world wouldn't believe them without hard proof, and the last thing they needed was for the syndicate to twist the story and paint them as liars. She made a few calls to her most trusted allies, people who had the resources and connections to get things done behind the scenes. She needed to make sure that the evidence was secure, and that everything Zoe had uncovered could be verified. Her mind raced as she thought of the people she needed to involve: journalists who had a reputation for digging deep, lawyers who could fight this battle in the courts, and experts in technology who could help expose the full scope of the corruption. But the most important thing was that they needed to act quickly. The longer they waited, the more time the syndicate would have to cover their tracks. Amara stood up, walking across the room as she thought. Her reflection in the window stared back at her, a woman with the power to make a change, but also one who had seen the ugly side of the world. The fight ahead wouldn't be easy, and it wasn't going to be over in one battle. This was a war not just against the criminals who had infiltrated law enforcement, but against an entire system that had allowed them to thrive unchecked. She thought about the countless people who had suffered in silence, the ones who didn't have the resources or the platform to stand up and fight. She had a responsibility to them, to every person who had been overlooked, dismissed, or oppressed by the system. This wasn't just about her. It was about making sure that what happened to her didn't happen to anyone else. As she gathered the information she needed, her phone rang. It was Zoe. She picked up the call without hesitation. "I've sent everything I have," Zoe said, her voice calm but tinged with urgency. "I've uncovered everything I could about Lawson and the syndicate. It's bad, Amara. Worse than we thought." Amara's grip on the phone tightened. "I know. I read the files. We need to act fast. We've got one shot at this. The syndicate is already trying to cover their tracks, and we need to be one step ahead of them." "Agreed," Zoe replied. "I've secured the footage. It's going public soon, but we need to ensure that we have every angle covered. The more people who see it, the better." Amara nodded. "I'm with you. We can't afford to wait. Let's get this out there. I'll start putting together a team to handle the legal side, and I'll have my people on the ground. This doesn't stop until we bring them down." Zoe paused for a moment. "We're in this together. And we're not just going after Lawson. We're going after the entire system." "Exactly," Amara said, her voice firm. "We expose it all. This stops now." The conversation ended, and Amara's mind shifted into overdrive. She had no time to waste. She immediately began organizing her resources, reaching out to those who would stand with her. She needed a public relations team, journalists who could break the story in a way that would get the attention it deserved, and legal experts who could handle the inevitable backlash. The syndicate was powerful, but Amara had something they didn't: the truth. She paced back and forth, strategizing every move. They had to be smart, calculated. The syndicate wouldn't go down easily. But Amara was prepared. She wasn't afraid. She had worked too hard, overcome too much, to let these criminals continue their reign of terror. As she made the final arrangements, a sense of resolve washed over her. The attack that had been made on her wasn't just an attack on her body. It was an attack on everything she stood for. It was an attack on justice, on the very idea of fairness. And now, it was time for her to take that fight back. This wasn't just about retribution. It was about creating a legacy of change, a future where people like her no longer had to fight for their basic rights. Amara wasn't going to be a victim. She was going to be the one who brought the fight to them. Amara sat at her desk, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Every decision she made now was crucial. She was no longer just a businesswoman fighting for racial justice. She was a woman at the center of a storm that threatened to expose the darkest corners of society. The syndicate was powerful, their reach extended far beyond what she had initially realized. The information Zoe had uncovered was damning, and they both knew it. but knowledge alone wouldn't bring them victory. It would take more than just a few pieces of evidence to dismantle the network they were up against. Her phone buzzed on the desk, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Zoe. Amara didn't hesitate to answer. "We're running out of time." Zoe's voice came through, sharp but focused. "The story's already starting to gain traction. The media is buzzing, but we need to make sure we stay ahead of the curve. If they get ahead of us, they'll spin the narrative and bury us." Amara leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen in front of her. She could feel the pressure mounting. She had always prided herself on being a strategist, but this was unlike anything she had ever encountered. They were up against an enemy that had been operating in the shadows for years, with resources, power, and connections that could crush them if they weren't careful. "I know," Amara replied, her voice steady. "I'm already setting things in motion. We've got the legal team on standby, the PR team ready to manage the fallout, and I've already contacted a few reporters who have the credibility to break this wide open. We just need to make sure the truth gets out there before they have a chance to stop it." Zoe hesitated. "You sure you're ready for this? Once we go public with this, there's no turning back. They're going to come after us with everything they've got." "I've never been afraid of a fight," Amara said, the resolve in her tone unwavering. "I've fought my whole life for what I believe in. This is no different. We're doing this for everyone who's ever been silenced, who's ever been oppressed by the system. We're not backing down." Zoe's voice softened. "All right then. I'll keep monitoring the situation on my end. We need to get all our ducks in a row, make sure every angle is covered. We can't afford any mistakes now." Amara nodded even though Zoe couldn't see her. She had worked with her fair share of teams, but there was something about Zoe's quiet determination that reassured her. They were in this together, and she wasn't going to let fear or uncertainty stop them. With the call ended, Amara turned her attention to the task at hand. She had already begun preparing the statement that would go public, something direct, concise, and unflinching. She couldn't afford to sugarcoat anything. The people needed to see the truth, raw and unfiltered. But even more than that, they needed to understand the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about her. It was about a broken system that needed to be repaired, a society that had allowed corruption to thrive unchecked for far too long. She clicked through the files Zoe had sent, reviewing every detail, double-checking that everything was in order. Lawson wasn't just a single bad cop, he was a cog in a much larger machine. The deeper she dug, the more she uncovered. The syndicate was everywhere, deep in the police force, in politics, in big business. Amara had no illusions about the fight they were facing. The odds were stacked against them, and every move they made would be scrutinized. But she had one thing that none of them could take from her: the truth. The truth was a weapon, and she was going to use it. Amara shifted her attention to the messages from her team. The PR people were already working on a strategy for how to handle the public fallout. They knew the media would latch onto the story, but they also knew that it was easy to manipulate public opinion. They couldn't let the story be distorted or hijacked by the wrong voices. She had to stay in control of the narrative. The journalists she had reached out to were reliable, but they were going to need solid evidence. Zoe's footage, the detailed documents about Lawson and the syndicate's operations, everything had to be meticulously organized. One slip-up could be disastrous. She felt a familiar surge of determination rise within her. She had spent years building her business empire, facing down every obstacle, every barrier placed in front of her simply because of her race and gender. She had made it through, time and time again. This was no different. It was just a bigger fight, one with higher stakes, but one that she was prepared to win. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Zoe. "Check this out. I've got something new. It's big." Amara's heart rate picked up. She quickly opened the message, her eyes scanning the new information. This was exactly what they needed. A key player in the syndicate had just been linked to multiple accounts of bribery and illegal arms trading. Zoe had managed to dig up a trail of financial transactions that pointed directly to one of the city's most influential political figures. This wasn't just about a corrupt cop anymore. This was about a deeply entrenched network of power, one that had been manipulating everything from law enforcement to corporate policy for years. Amara quickly began drafting a new message to her team, updating them on the new information and adjusting their strategy accordingly. She needed everyone on the same page. They couldn't afford any delays, any distractions. The truth was out there, and it was time to make sure it came to light. As the minutes passed, the weight of the situation became more real. Amara had never been one to shy away from a challenge, but this was bigger than anything she had ever faced. There was no room for error. The people behind the syndicate would stop at nothing to protect their interests. They had money, influence, and a tight grip on the system. But Amara had something more important than any of that. She had the truth, and she was going to use it to tear down everything they had built. She glanced at the clock. Time was running out. She needed to move faster, make quicker decisions. Every second counted now. With a steady hand, Amara hit send on her message to Zoe. They were ready. They had everything they needed to bring this corrupt system to its knees. And they weren't going to stop until they did. The clock was ticking. Amara felt the pressure weighing down on her as the plan began to take shape. It was no longer just a fight for justice, it was a battle for survival. The syndicate, the people behind the corruption that had nearly broken her, were closing in. They wouldn't let her expose their network without a fight. But Amara wasn't going to back down. She wasn't the kind of person who would allow herself to be silenced, no matter how deep the stakes were. This fight had become personal. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had suffered because of a broken system. And now, she was going to do everything in her power to bring it down. The footage was out, the evidence was in the hands of trusted journalists, and the public was beginning to take notice. But Amara knew that it wasn't enough to simply release the information and wait for the fallout. She had to make sure the right people were paying attention, that the story didn't get lost in the noise of everyday headlines. She had to take control of the narrative. Zoe had been working behind the scenes, pulling together more damning evidence. Every day, it seemed like a new piece of the puzzle was falling into place, and each revelation made the picture clearer. Lawson, the racist cop who had attacked her, wasn't just an isolated bad actor. He was a cog in a much larger wheel, a system of corruption that had been operating under the radar for years. And now, with Zoe's help, Amara had the power to expose it all. But with each step they took, the danger grew. The people involved in this syndicate were powerful, and they had their hands in everything: law enforcement, politics, business. They weren't going to let a couple of women take down their empire without fighting back, and Amara knew that. But she also knew that if they didn't do this now, if they didn't push forward with everything they had, then nothing would ever change. The corrupt system would remain in place, continuing to exploit the vulnerable, and perpetuating the cycle of injustice that she had spent her entire life fighting against. She called Zoe again. The urgency in her voice was unmistakable. "They know," Amara said, her voice tight with tension. "They're coming after us. They've already started discrediting the story, planting fake narratives. We need to go public with everything. We need to make this as loud as possible." Zoe's response was quick, almost immediate. "I've got the next piece. The one that ties them directly to the mayor's office. It's huge, Amara. This is the kind of evidence they can't ignore. But we have to make sure it doesn't get buried under the weight of their lies." "I'll handle that," Amara said firmly. "I'm going to make sure we're heard. No matter what." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Zoe didn't have to say it, but Amara could feel the unspoken concern. This wasn't just about a corrupt cop anymore. This was about dismantling an entire network. And when that network was as deep and pervasive as this one, the risks weren't just professional, they were personal. The mayor's office, the high-ranking politicians, the business moguls, this was a world that Amara knew well. She had spent years navigating the complex relationships between power players in the corporate and political arenas. But what she had learned over time was that people like Lawson, the ones who operated with such blatant disregard for the law, were often just the visible pieces in a larger puzzle. The ones pulling the strings were always hidden, always protected by layers of money and influence. Now, it was time to pull back the curtain. Amara didn't waste time. She reached out to her media contacts, and within hours, they had secured a press conference. It would be risky, but it was the best way to take control. She wasn't going to wait for the syndicate to strike first. She wasn't going to let them turn the story into something that would leave her silenced or marginalized. This time, she was going to own the narrative. She was going to make sure the world saw the truth. As she prepared for the press conference, Amara knew that this would be the defining moment. The people in that room, the journalists, the politicians, the business leaders, would be looking to her for answers. They would want to know what she had uncovered, why she was speaking out, and what she planned to do about it. She wasn't going to back down. She had to be clear, decisive, and unyielding. This wasn't about her reputation. This was about exposing the system for what it truly was. The day of the press conference arrived. Amara stood before the cameras, the weight of what she was about to do settling on her shoulders. The room was filled with reporters, photographers, and a few individuals from the mayor's office who clearly weren't happy to be there. But Amara knew that this was her chance. This was the moment when everything could change. She cleared her throat, adjusting the microphone in front of her. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady, but with an edge of authority. "I'm here today because I believe that justice has not been served. What happened to me, at the hands of a police officer, was not an isolated incident. What I've uncovered goes far beyond one man's actions. It is part of a larger, more insidious system of corruption that has permeated every level of our law enforcement, our politics, and our businesses." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle in. The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. "For months, I've worked alongside individuals who have risked everything to expose the truth," she continued. "This is not just about one cop, it's about a network that has been profiting off of the suffering of everyday people. It's about a system that has allowed criminals to thrive under the guise of law and order. And it's about time we put an end to it." The reporters shifted in their seats, murmurs spreading through the room. Amara pressed on, revealing the evidence that Zoe had uncovered, the financial transactions, the connections to powerful political figures, the way the syndicate had used law enforcement as its enforcers. "This is just the beginning," she said. "We are going to hold these people accountable. And we're going to do it together. The truth is no longer something they can hide." The press conference was a turning point. The syndicate's carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel. But even as Amara spoke, she knew that the fight was far from over. The backlash would come swiftly. The media would be inundated with attempts to discredit her. They would try to twist the story, to make her the villain, to shift the narrative in their favor. But Amara wasn't afraid. She had already made her decision. She had taken the first step, and there was no going back now. The truth was out, and there was no way to silence it. Amara sat back in her chair, staring at the glowing screen in front of her. The press conference had just ended, and the fallout was already beginning. The story had exploded. News outlets were covering every angle, social media was ablaze, and for the first time in years, the conversation was no longer about the usual distractions. People were talking about systemic corruption, about the police officer who had assaulted her, about the syndicate that had quietly controlled the city for far too long. The truth was out there, and the world was listening. But she wasn't naive enough to believe that this was the end. Far from it. What she had started wasn't just a scandal, it was a revolution. And revolutions were never easy. They were messy, they were dangerous, and they always came with a price. Amara knew she had just put herself at the center of something much bigger than she could have imagined. The network she had exposed wasn't just some rogue officers or corrupt politicians, it was a system, a powerful, entrenched web of influence that controlled much of what happened in the city, and likely much farther beyond. The people who stood to lose the most from this exposure would come after her with everything they had. She had already seen the first signs of retaliation, leaked stories, fabricated allegations, and subtle threats designed to intimidate her into silence. They thought that money, power, and influence could make her back down. They didn't understand her. Amara had spent her entire life battling systems that were built to keep her in her place. She had never been the type to run when things got tough. If anything, it was when things got difficult that she thrived. She had learned to navigate spaces that weren't made for people like her, to fight back against the constant pressure to conform. The same tenacity that had made her a successful entrepreneur and an advocate for social justice was now going to be what brought the syndicate down. But she wasn't going to do it alone. This was a fight that would require more than just her voice. It would require the combined efforts of everyone who believed in the cause, people who had been quiet for far too long, people who had been too afraid to speak out. Zoe, who had uncovered so much of the syndicate's operations, was one of the first to reach out, and Amara knew that their partnership was crucial. Zoe had done the work in the shadows, but now, it was time to shine a light on it. Amara called her, her voice steady despite the whirlwind inside her. Zoe, we've got momentum. It's happening. But this isn't over. We need to get ahead of them before they can twist this narrative. We need to be the ones telling the story from here on out. Zoe's response was calm, but Amara could hear the edge in her voice. I'm on it. I've already secured more information, stuff that links the syndicate to other cities. This is bigger than we thought. The mayor's office, the police department, even private contractors, they're all involved. Amara felt a chill run down her spine. She had known it was bad, but hearing the full extent of it, knowing just how far the corruption stretched, was another level of horrifying. This wasn't just a few bad apples, it was an entire system, one that had been running for decades, if not longer. And Amara had the power to bring it all down. We can't wait for the press to decide the angle, Amara said, her mind already racing with ideas. We need to bring the truth to the people directly. We'll get to the journalists, yes, but we also need to go public in a bigger way. This has to be everywhere: social media, podcasts, live streams. We can't just tell our story, we need to create a movement. Zoe agreed. You're right. I'm already coordinating with a few activist groups. If we push together, we can force their hand. This isn't just about exposing corruption, it's about giving people the tools to fight back. It's about turning this into something that doesn't go away after a few weeks. Amara smiled, the weight of her responsibility settling into something more manageable. This wasn't just about her fight for justice anymore. It was about showing the world that systemic corruption could be dismantled, that it wasn't an immovable force. That even the most powerful institutions could be challenged and defeated if enough people were willing to stand up. Good, she said. Let's do this. I want everyone to feel like they have a stake in this. We're not just exposing the criminals at the top, we're tearing down the entire system that allows this to happen. As Amara prepared for the next phase of the campaign, her mind flashed to all the faces she had met over the years, faces of people who had come to her for help, for guidance. She had always tried to use her platform to give a voice to the voiceless, but now it was clear that the fight for equality was no longer something that could be fought alone. This was a fight that belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced. She had to make sure that when the world looked at this moment, they didn't just see a scandal or a story, they saw a movement. The press conference had been the first step, but now they needed to mobilize. It was time for action. Amara wasn't just looking for retribution, she was looking for transformation. The whole system needed to be restructured, and she had the power to make that happen. But she needed the people behind her. She needed them to see that this fight wasn't just about one woman's trauma, it was about a fundamental shift in how the world operated. The phone buzzed again. It was Zoe. We've got a new piece of the puzzle, Zoe said. This just came through. We've got documentation that ties the mayor directly to the syndicate. I can't believe how deep this goes. If we push this, it's over for them. Amara's pulse quickened. This was it. The final push. They had what they needed. The walls had been breached. Now, it was time to drive the truth home. Good, Amara said, her voice steady. Let's make sure the world knows. We can't stop now. We're finishing what we started. Zoe's voice was resolute. Let's bring them down. With that, Amara set her sights on the next step. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time, she felt like the end was within reach. The system that had so long protected the corrupt was starting to crack. And it was no longer just a story, it was a revolution.